Chapter 1. The Shadows of the South Bronx. The air in the South Bronx in the 1940s didn't just sit. It hung, heavy with the scent of coal dust, boiled cabbage, and the electric hum of the elevated trains rattling the window panes of the tenements. For young Alfredo, known to everyone as Sonny, the world was a narrow corridor of brick and fire escapes. Born in East Harlem to Sicilian parents whose marriage fractured before he could even form a solid memory of them, Sonny was uprooted to his grandparents' crowded apartment. It was a home of intense old-world emotions. His mother, Rose, was a fragile woman, often burdened by the weight of a world she wasn't quite equipped to handle. His grandfather, James Girardi, a man whose roots coincidentally trace back to a small Sicilian town called Corleone, was the stoic anchor of the household. In this cramped space where Italian was spoken as often as English, Sonny learned his first lesson in drama. Life was loud, life was tactile, and life was survival. By the age of 9, Sonny was already a creature of the streets. He wasn't a brawler by nature, but he was a chameleon. He started smoking at 9. By 12, he was drinking. He and his small band of friends, kids with nicknames like the Actor, which they ironically called him because he was always telling tall tales, would roam the rooftops. They climbed over the jagged skyline of the Bronx like urban explorers, looking down at a city that seemed to offer nothing but more of the same. But Sonny had a secret escape. On the days when the tension in the apartment became too thick, or the grayness of the streets too suffocating, Rose would take him to the local cinema. It was there, in the flickering darkness of the movie house, that the world transformed. The silver screen didn't just show stories, it showed possibilities. He watched the titans of the era: Brando, Clift, Dean, and felt a strange magnetic pull. When they returned home, the movie didn't end for Sonny. He would stand in front of his grandmother and reenact every scene, every gesture, and every line of dialogue he had just witnessed. "Look at him," his grandfather would say, watching the boy transform into a cowboy or a detective. "He's got the devil in him." But it wasn't the devil. It was a desperate need to be someone else. Acting wasn't a hobby, it was a protective layer. In school, he was a poor student, distracted and frequently absent, but in the auditorium, he was a king. He was accepted into the High School of Performing Arts, a beacon of hope in Manhattan. For a kid from the South Bronx, crossing the bridge into Manhattan felt like crossing into another dimension. However, the reality of poverty is a gravity that is hard to defy. The conflict at home grew. His mother, struggling with her own health and mental well-being, couldn't understand why he wouldn't just find a steady trade. The arguments were operatic, filled with the raw, unshielded emotion that would later become his trademark on screen. At 17, after failing nearly every subject except English, Sonny dropped out. The fallout was final. He left home with nothing but the clothes on his back and a burning, illogical conviction that he belonged on a stage. The years that followed were a descent into the Bohemian struggle of 1950s New York, but there was little glamour in it. He worked as a messenger, a shoe shiner, a supermarket checker, and a furniture mover. He slept on the floors of theaters, in friends' apartments, and occasionally on the street. He was often hungry, sometimes literally penniless, but he was Sonny the Actor now. He began studying at the HB studio in Greenwich Village. It was there that he met Charlie Laughton, a teacher who would become his mentor and the father figure he never had. Laughton didn't just teach him technique, he gave him books Rimbaud, Joyce, Balzac. He fed the boy's mind while the boy's body withered from lack of food. It was during this period that tragedy struck with a double-edged blade. In 1962, his mother Rose died at the age of 43. A year later, his grandfather James passed away. The two pillars of his childhood, the woman who gave him his sensitivity and the man who gave him his strength, were gone. I was 22 years old, Pacino would later recall, and the two most influential people in my life were gone, which sent me into a tailspin. Sitting in a cold water flat, grieving and alone, Al Pacino reached a crossroads. He could let the streets of New York swallow him whole, as they had so many of his childhood friends, or he could take that grief, that tailspin, and weaponize it. He chose the latter. He began to audition with a ferocity that bordered on the terrifying. He wasn't looking for a job. He was looking for an exorcism. The method was calling. And soon the doors of the actor's studio, the legendary sanctum of Lee Strasberg, would either open for him or be kicked down. Chapter 2: The Method and the Miracle. The mid-1960s in New York City was a pressure cooker of artistic revolution. In the smoke-filled cafes of Greenwich Village and the cramped rehearsal spaces of the West Side, a new breed of performer was being forged. They didn't want the polished, mid-Atlantic perfection of the old studio stars. They wanted the dirt under the fingernails, the stutter in the voice, and the raw, unvarnished truth of the human condition. For Al Pacino, this wasn't just a stylistic choice, it was the only way he knew how to breathe. After years of rejection, the turning point came in 1966 when he was finally accepted into the actor's studio. This was the holy grail of the craft, the sanctuary presided over by the legendary Lee Strasberg. Entering the studio was like stepping into a secular cathedral. To Pacino, Strasberg was a titan, a man who could look into an actor's soul and find the hidden gears of their trauma. For the first time, the devil his grandfather had seen in him was given a name: the method. He learned to reach back into the memories of the South Bronx, the hunger, the grief for his mother, the cold New York winters, and channel that energy into a controlled explosion on stage. The actor's studio meant so much to me in my life, Pacino would later reflect. It was a remarkable turning point period. It was there that I realized I could actually make a living at this. The theater world began to vibrate with his name. In 1968, he starred in Israel Horovitz's The Indian Wants the Bronx. He played Murph, a street thug, with a chilling, volatile authenticity that left audiences trembling. He won an Obie Award. A year later, he moved to Broadway in Does a Tiger Wear a Necktie? He played a psychotic drug addict with such terrifying conviction that he won a Tony Award despite the play only running for 39 performances. The industry began to whisper. Producers saw a young man who looked like a street kid, but possessed the intensity of a young Brando. Yet Hollywood remained a distant, gleaming fortress. Pacino made his film debut in Me, Natalie, 1969. But it was 1971's The Panic in Needle Park that changed everything. Playing a desperate drug addict, Pacino didn't act. He seemed to vanish into the gray, needle-strewn alleys of Manhattan. Across the country, a young, ambitious director named Francis Ford Coppola was watching. Coppola had been hired by Paramount Pictures to direct an adaptation of Mario Puzo's pulp bestseller, The Godfather. The studio wanted a blockbuster. They wanted big names. They wanted Robert Redford, Warren Beatty, or Jack Nicholson for the role of the collegiate son-turned-mafia don, Michael Corleone. But Coppola had seen a vision. He had seen Al Pacino. When I read the book, Coppola said, I kept seeing him. I didn't have another second choice. It was just Al. The battle that followed is one of the most legendary conflicts in cinematic history. To the executives at Paramount, led by the tan, charismatic Robert Evans, Pacino was a disaster. He was too short. He was too ethnic-looking. He was too quiet. Evans famously referred to Pacino as that little dwarf and complained that he looked like a common Italian waiter rather than a movie star. Paramount demanded screen tests. They tested everyone. They flew Pacino out to California multiple times, and each time the executives hated him more. Pacino, feeling the hostility, became even more withdrawn. He didn't want to be there. He felt like he was being prodded like a circus animal. He was ready to quit. They didn't want me and I didn't want them, Pacino recalled. But Coppola was relentless. He gambled his own career on the kid from the Bronx. He kept pushing, kept retesting, and kept fighting the studio suits in heated boardrooms. The pressure on Pacino was immense. He was staying in a cheap motel, plagued by anxiety, wondering why he had left the safety of the New York stage for this Hollywood madness. The breaking point came during the filming of the Salozzo scene, the pivotal moment in the movie where Michael Corleone must commit his first murder in a small Italian restaurant in the Bronx. The studio was still looking for a reason to fire him. They were watching the rushes, the daily footage, with a cynical eye. They thought Pacino was boring because he was playing Michael as a quiet, watchful soldier, hiding his power. They wanted fire. Al was giving them ice. Coppola, sensing the axe was about to fall, moved the filming of the restaurant scene up in the schedule. He told Pacino, Al, you've got to show them something. You've got to bring it now or we're both gone. The set was a small restaurant in the Bronx, not far from where Al had grown up. The air was thick with the smell of garlic and cigar smoke. Pacino sat across from Al Lettieri, Sollozzo, and Sterling Hayden, Captain McCluskey. He went into his method trance. He focused on the sound of the elevated train outside, the same sound that had rattled his grandmother's windows. As the cameras rolled, something shifted in Pacino's eyes. The vulnerability of the college boy evaporated, replaced by a cold, dark void. When he returned from the bathroom with the planted revolver, his hands were shaking not from fear, but from the adrenaline of a man crossing a point of no return. He fired. The look on his face as he dropped the gun and walked out of the restaurant wasn't the look of a movie star. It was the look of a man who had just lost his soul. When the executives at Paramount saw that footage the next day, the room went silent. Robert Evans stopped talking. The little dwarf had vanished, and in his place stood the Don. The miracle had happened. Al Pacino had survived the system. But as the filming of The Godfather wrapped, Al had no idea that he was about to become the face of a new era of cinema. He was still just a guy from the Bronx who needed a paycheck. He didn't realize that when the world finally saw Michael Corleone, his life would never, ever be private again. Chapter 3: The Reluctant Icon in the Golden Decade. When The Godfather premiered in March 1972, the world didn't just watch a movie, they witnessed a seismic shift in the cultural landscape. The lines at the Lowe's State Theater in Times Square wrapped around the block, a restless sea of trench coats and fedoras. Inside, the silence during Michael Corleone's scenes was deafening. By the time the credits rolled, Al Pacino was no longer that little dwarf from the South Bronx. He was the most famous man in America. But for Pacino, fame was not a trophy, it was a cage. While the world clamored for a piece of the new king, Al was retreating into the shadows of his New York apartment. He felt a profound sense of dislocation. He was a theater actor who lived for the process, the rehearsals, and the nightly transformation. Suddenly, he was a commodity, a face on a magazine, a target for paparazzi. He skipped the Academy Awards ceremony that year, partly in protest of being nominated for Best Supporting Actor instead of lead, but mostly because the thought of the red carpet made his skin crawl. "I was not prepared for the celebrity," he would later admit. "It was like being hit by a freight train. I didn't know how to handle the noise." To drown out the noise, he went back to the only thing that made sense: the work. And the work he chose in the years following The Godfather would define the new Hollywood era, a gritty, uncompromising period where the hero was often a broken, sweating, desperate man. In 1973, he teamed up with the master of New York realism, Sidney Lumet, for Serpico. The story of Frank Serpico, the whistle-blowing cop who refused to take a bribe, was personal for Pacino. It was a story about an outsider standing against a corrupt system, a mirror of his own battle with the Hollywood establishment. Pacino's preparation was obsessive. He spent weeks with the real Frank Serpico, living in his apartment, watching the way he moved, the way he looked at people with a mixture of hope and paranoia. He grew the beard, let his hair go wild, and donned the eccentric Bohemian clothes of the undercover cop. On set, he was frank. During one break in filming, he was so deep in character that he actually pulled over a truck driver and threatened to arrest him for exhaust pollution, forgetting he wasn't a real officer. The result was a performance of raw, vibrating energy. When Serpico screams at his fellow officers in the rainy back alleys of the city, you don't see an actor delivering lines. You see a man whose soul is being eroded by the weight of his own integrity. Hardly catching his breath, he dove straight into the darkness for The Godfather Part 2, 1974. If the first film was about Michael's ascent, the second was about his spiritual incineration. Pacino played Michael with a terrifying, subterranean stillness. He was the center of a storm, a man who had won everything and lost his humanity in the process. The Michael Corleone stare, cold, black, and impenetrable, became the definitive image of 1970s cinema. He was nominated for an Oscar again. He lost again. But the critics knew Pacino was doing something no one else could do. He was making silence scream. However, it was 1975's Dog Day Afternoon that perhaps best captured the Al Pacino of the 70s. Reunited with Sidney Lumet, he played Sonny Wurtzek, a high-strung, incompetent bank robber trying to fund his partner's gender reassignment surgery. The production was grueling. Lumet wanted the film to feel like a documentary. The heat on the set was real. The sweat on Pacino's brow was real. In the legendary Attica scene, Pacino improvised the chant, tapping into the boiling social unrest of the era. He stood in the middle of the street, surrounded by real police and a real crowd, his voice cracking with a desperate, frantic charisma. He was vulnerable, hilarious, and tragic all at once. Sonny was the most exhausting role of my life, Pacino said. I was living on nerves and coffee. I felt like I was vibrating at a frequency that was going to shatter me. By the end of 1975, Al Pacino had achieved a run of 4 masterpieces in 4 years: The Godfather, Serpico, The Godfather Part 2, and Dog Day Afternoon. It was a streak of creative lightning that has rarely been matched in history, but the cost was starting to show. He was drinking heavily to cope with the anxiety of his fame. He was becoming increasingly reclusive, often hiding behind sunglasses and hats, walking the streets of New York like a ghost. He was at the top of the mountain, but the air was getting thin. He was the voice of a generation of outsiders, but he felt like he had lost his own voice in the process. He needed to step back. He needed to return to his roots. Little did he know that the 1980s would bring a whole new kind of madness, one that would involve a white suit, a mountain of coke, and a character named Tony Montana. Chapter 4: The White Heat and the Long Silence. The 1980s arrived in Hollywood not with a whisper, but with the glare of neon and the frantic beat of a synthesizer. For Al Pacino, the decade began as a collision course with a changing culture. The introspective, soulful cinema of the 70s was being pushed aside by the high-concept blockbuster. Pacino, a creature of the actor's studio, felt like a man out of time. His first foray into this new decade was Cruising, 1980, directed by William Friedkin. It was a dark, subterranean journey into the leather bars of New York's underground gay scene. The production was a nightmare. The film was met with fierce protests and picketing. Pacino, caught in the middle of a cultural firestorm, found himself defending a film that even he seemed to find unsettling. The critics were harsh. The silence he had sought in the late 70s was being replaced by a different kind of noise, the sound of a reputation under fire. Seeking a change of pace, he turned towards something operatic, something that would allow him to shed the quiet skin of Michael Corleone once and for all. That something was Scarface, 1983, the resurrection of Tony Montana. The collaboration between director Brian De Palma and writer Oliver Stone was intended to be a remake of the 1932 classic, but Pacino saw it as something more: a Shakespearean tragedy fueled by the American dream on steroids. To play Tony Montana, a Cuban refugee who builds a coke empire in Miami, Pacino underwent a total metamorphosis. He worked with a dialect coach to perfect the thick, guttural Cuban accent. He trained with boxers to give Tony a predatory, forward-leaning gait. He spent months under the sun until his skin took on a leathery, bronze sheen. On the set in Los Angeles and Miami, the atmosphere was thick with the scent of prop coke, baby powder and laxatives, and the humidity of a fake Florida summer. During the filming of the final shootout, the infamous "Say Hello to My Little Friend" sequence, Pacino actually burned his hand on the barrel of his prop M16, an injury so severe it shut down production for weeks. He was literally scarred by the role. When Scarface was released, the elite critics were appalled. They called it garish, excessively violent, and accused Pacino of overacting. They missed the point. Pacino wasn't trying to be realistic. He was playing a modern-day Richard III. He was playing the vacuum left behind by a society that valued nothing but excess. I wanted to do a character who was an underdog, who was a rebel, Pacino said. Tony Montana was a guy who didn't care about the consequences. He was a force of nature. While the critics sneered, the streets listened. Scarface didn't just become a movie, it became a scripture for hip-hop culture and the disenfranchised. Tony Montana became an icon of defiance. But for Pacino, the over-the-top performance was a double-edged sword. It cemented his legendary status, but it also left him physically and creatively depleted. The fall in the fortress of the stage. Then came 1985, and with it, a disaster of epic proportions. Revolution, a historical drama about the American War of Independence. The film was plagued by production issues, bad weather in England, and a script that felt unfinished. Pacino played Tom Dobb, a reluctant soldier. He was sick during much of the filming, battling a severe bout of pneumonia. When the film was released, it was a box office catastrophe. The critics didn't just pounce, they buried him. For the first time in his career, Al Pacino felt the cold wind of irrelevance. He was 45 years old. His last 3 films had been critical or commercial failures, and the industry that once worshipped him was moving on to younger, more bankable stars. So, Al Pacino did something unthinkable for a Hollywood star. He walked away. For the next 4 years, the man who had been Michael Corleone and Tony Montana effectively vanished from the silver screen. This period, often referred to by fans as the Gap, was a return to his spiritual home, the theater. He retreated to the small stages of New York and London. He worked on a personal film project called The Local Stigmatic, an experimental piece he funded out of his own pocket and refused to release commercially for years. He performed Shakespeare. He performed Caesar. He was often broke, or as broke as a movie star could be, having spent much of his fortune on his own artistic whims and living a life that didn't prioritize financial gain. In these years of exile, Pacino rediscovered the sound of his own voice. Away from the cameras, the trailers, and the studio notes, he found the purity of the craft again. He spent hours in Greenwich Village cafes, his face hidden by a hat and dark glasses, reading scripts and talking about Brecht and Artaud. He was no longer a movie star. He was back to being Sonny the actor. I needed to find out if I still wanted to do it. He would later reflect on those quiet years. I needed to see if there was a life for me outside of the frame of a camera. The return sea of love. By 1989, the bank accounts were low, and the itch to return to film had become undeniable. He chose a script that felt like the New York he knew, Sea of Love. Playing Frank Keller, a tired, alcoholic detective looking for a serial killer through the personals ads, Pacino returned to the screen with a new kind of energy. The wild hair was gone, replaced by a weary, weathered face. The operatic shouting of Tony Montana was replaced by a vulnerable, soulful loneliness. When the film became a hit, Hollywood breathed a sigh of relief. The king was back. But he wasn't the same man. He was older, wiser, and ready to enter a third act that would see him finally claim the one prize that had eluded him through the decade of his greatest work. The 90s were calling, and with them, a chance to reunite with Michael Corleone one last time, to face off against Robert De Niro, and to find hoo-ah in the most unexpected of places. Chapter 5. The Resurrection and the Crown. The 1990s did not merely herald a new decade for Al Pacino. They offered a redemption song. After the long silence of the mid-80s, the man from the Bronx returned to the silver screen with a weathered grace, his face now a map of every character he had ever inhabited. The boyish intensity of the 70s had matured into a thunderous, operatic power. He was no longer just an actor, he was a monument. The decade began with a ghost. In 1990, Francis Ford Coppola called him back to the world of shadows for The Godfather Part 3. To play Michael Corleone again was to confront the weight of his own legend. This Michael was different, guilt-ridden, diabetic, and desperate for legitimacy. Standing in the sun-drenched courtyards of Sicily, Pacino delivered the line that would define his return to the mainstream. "Just when I thought I was out, they pulled me back in." It was a meta-commentary on his own career. He had tried to escape the gravitational pull of the mafia genre, but the world wouldn't let him go. Yet the 90s would prove that Al Pacino had far more colors on his palette than just the dark hues of a dawn. The hua heard round the world. The pinnacle of this renaissance came in 1992 with Scent of a Woman. Pacino took on the role of Lieutenant Colonel Frank Slade, a blind, embittered veteran who decides to have one last hurrah in New York City. This was the performance that finally broke the Oscar curse. Pacino's preparation was, as always, total. He worked with the associated blind, learning to defocus his eyes so that he could move through a scene without ever truly looking at his co-stars. On set, he remained in character, walking with a cane and staring through people until they felt a chill. The role was loud, flamboyant, and filled with a desperate, tragic vitality. When he sat in that Cadillac or danced the tango with Gabrielle Anwar, he wasn't just playing a blind man. He was playing a man reclaiming his soul. On the night of March 29, 1993, at the Dorothy Chandler Pavilion, the air was thick with anticipation. Pacino had been nominated 7 times before and had walked away empty-handed every single time. He sat in the audience, glassy-eyed and numb, listening to the nominees for Best Actor. When his name was finally called, the entire room erupted. It wasn't just an award for one movie, it was a standing ovation for a lifetime of work. Backstage, a triumphant Barbra Streisand gave him an A-OK sign and whispered, "I voted for you, Al." Pacino, clutching the gold statue, felt a strange sense of peace. He took the stage and with a dry mouth and a humble heart, opened with a line that brought the house down. "You broke my streak." He thanked his mentor, Charlie Laughton, and Lee Strasberg, closing the loop on a journey that had started in the tenements of the Bronx 40 years earlier. Heat, the coffee shop summit. If the Oscar was his coronation, then 1995's Heat was his duel. For decades, film fans had dreamt of seeing Al Pacino and Robert De Niro share the screen. They had both appeared in The Godfather Part 2, but in different timelines. Now director Michael Mann was bringing them face to face in a high-stakes crime epic. The legendary coffee shop scene at Kate Mantilini in Beverly Hills was treated like a state summit. Mann chose to film it at 1 o'clock in the morning To capture a specific exhausted intensity, there were no rehearsals. Pacino and De Niro didn't want to practice their chemistry. They wanted to discover it in front of the lens. The set was quiet, save for the hum of the refrigerator and the clink of silverware. Pacino, playing the frantic, high-strung detective Vincent Hanna, sat across from De Niro's cool surgical thief, Neil McCauley. It was a masterclass in contrast, Pacino's fire versus De Niro's ice. As they spoke about their dreams and the dead end of their lives, the two titans didn't even blink. Most of the scene was captured in a single, miraculous 11th take. In those 6 minutes, the history of 20th century acting was distilled into two men sitting over a cup of black coffee, the anti-Don, Lefty Ruggiero. As the 90s progressed, Pacino continued to subvert his own image. In 1997's Donnie Brasco, he didn't play the king, he played the peasant. As Benjamin Lefty Ruggiero, a low-level mob-foot soldier who had been passed over for 30 years, Pacino gave a performance of heartbreaking fragility. Lefty was a spoke on a wheel, a man who lived in a cramped apartment with a dying son and a drawer full of Fugazi jewelry. This was the antithesis of Michael Corleone. Pacino wore a cheap, worn-out leather jacket and walked with the slumped shoulders of a man defeated by time. The relationship between Lefty and the undercover agent Johnny Depp, became the emotional core of the film. When Lefty realizes he has been betrayed, the look in Pacino's eyes, the quiet acceptance of his impending death, remains one of the most haunting moments in his filmography. He closed the decade with The Insider, 1999, playing the real-life 60 Minutes producer Lowell Bergman. It was a performance of weary integrity, proving that even without a gun or a catchphrase, Pacino could command a screen through sheer moral force. The Legend of Sonny Boy. As the 21st century dawned, Al Pacino transitioned into the role of the elder statesman. He continued to work with a relentless hunger, from the HBO epics like Angels in America to his late career reunion with Martin Scorsese in The Irishman 2019, where he played Jimmy Hoffa with a vibrant, tragic energy that earned him yet another Oscar nomination. In 2024, he released his long-awaited memoir, Sonny Boy. In its pages, he didn't write as a billionaire movie star, but as the kid from the South Bronx who just wanted to stay on the stage a little longer. He reflected on the friends he lost to the streets, the hunger of the lean years, and the strange, hallucinatory experience of becoming a household name. Today, Al Pacino remains a creature of New York. You might still see him walking the streets of the city, hidden behind a scarf and those trademark dark glasses, a ghost of the Bronx who conquered the world. He didn't just act in movies. He created a language of emotion, a hoo-ah, a cold stare, a volcanic outburst that will be studied as long as there are stories to tell. The boy who used to reenact movie scenes for his grandmother on a tenement floor became the man who showed the world the devil and the angel inside us all. From the shadows of the South Bronx to the lights of the Dolby Theater, Al Pacino's life was more than a career. It was a testament to the power of the method, the endurance of the spirit, and the truth that even in the darkest room, if you have a story to tell, you are never truly in the dark.